It's great to be back. Hopefully you can hear my voice okay. How many am I speaking to for the second or third time? How many people have I met before? I know I've recognised you. Okay, that's fine. I haven't got very much overlap in my presentations from things that we've talked about before, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's a really challenging space thinking about entrepreneurship education, and the work that I do with Kath and Andy in this space is really trying to sort of open up people's thinking to what it is rather than what should they do, what should they adopt or what approach might they have, but just trying to think about what it could be in their own context. And so that's what I really want to get you guys to do, is to internalise the sorts of ideas we're going to discuss, but back into your own discipline, in your own area. So rather than viewing entrepreneurship education as this other discipline space, maybe start the session by thinking about it could just be a different way of doing what you already do, right? So it doesn't need to be anything more than a different way of doing what you're doing, and it might only be a tweak, or it could be something a bit more radical, all right? What I'd like you to do is to spend a couple of minutes thinking about who is your perfect graduate in the context of, oh, well, people talk to us about our graduates and how employable they are. There's something about the graduates that come out of our program, something that makes them really employable. So they may not have this status at the moment, but in a perfect world, what would it be about your graduates that would make them very employable in your field? How many people from engineering in here? We got any? Got a couple over the back, and a few over, we've got quite a few from engineering. So being able to work in a team, right, is a really big driver for employability. You can be the cleverest university student in the UK, but if you're not capable of working in a group environment with other people, you're unlikely to be employed or to be employed for very long, right? So those factors matter. So just take a little bit of time, write down, keep it in your mind, and we'll go around the room in a minute. What would it be that would signify this fantastic employable graduate that would come from your field of education? I'll leave you with that for a second. Who wants to offer a bit of an overview or an outline of this student? What are we thinking? What does your highly employable student look like?
Someone who has the ability to communicate complexity to lay audience.
Okay. What's your field? Engineering? Yep.
I'm an architect.
Yep.
So I would want somebody who not only understood the artistic side of architecture, but how architecture is delivered back to clients.
Yeah.
So being able to understand clients' needs.
Clients' needs,
not
yeah.
just the artistic element.
Okay, cool. How about anything different for your engineering?
Yeah, it's a problem solving.
Problem solving?
My career, I saw a lot of a tendency to be able to try and push things sideways or push things up the tree if things got a bit too difficult, rather than dealing with it on just being able to keep moving. Personal level, they push it up to management. Yeah, cool. How about you guys? What are you thinking?
I'm out with that. I'm Egyptologist.
Yep.
And, I'm back now to do this BGC programs.
Okay.
Right? Yes. It's very interesting to exactly see the performance of the work of student university.
Okay. How about you? What are you thinking? What sort of graduate would you like to be associated with?
Yeah, should we have very good communication skills?
And what your discipline area is?
Humanity.
Okay. Yeah.
And also creativity.
Yes.
It's very important.
So beyond creativity, communication skills, problem solving, anyone thinking of something? Yep.
My comment is really based on some conversation I had in Spain, just validating the program in Spain. And I asked this Spanish staff why a Spanish student would do an English or British or a Welsh degree, and rather than a Spanish degree. And they said, well, the Spanish degree is all theory-based. They don't make the students useful to the employers when they graduate.
Right.
They have to then be trained. Whereas a UK-based degree, has much more of that kind of applicable skills, employability, in that kind of general sense, which everyone mentioned.
Yeah.
Straight away out starting with. So my ideal graduate would be someone who's used to the employer immediately.
Yep.
Because that's the only reason they're going to get it.
We get a lot of German students coming to Australia. I'm not sure if you're in the same situation, PhD students. And a part of a lot of German PhD programs is that they need to do at least a semester or maybe 2 semesters in an English-speaking country so that they can have a greater marketability once they've done their PhD, because they'll have better English. So that's not something they want to deal with at the German end, right? Which is sort of similar to your situation. So hopefully you can see the introductory slide, which is this one. Hopefully you can read it, but it says, instead of employability, it says employability, right? It's not a new thing from me. This is actually quite a common phrase now in Australia. And you can think that about your own world. How might you employ your ability to create good graduates, but how might we help our graduates to employ their ability? Okay, so you can think about it both ways. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about it being able to celebrate the uneducated, the unfinished, and the uninterested, because I think that's one of the hurdles that we all face in trying to create employability, is that we've got a lot of students who they haven't learnt what they need to learn. They're most probably so focused on the piece of paper that they're going to be very unfinished, but in the wrong way. And more often than not, they're not that interested in what we're trying to do, right? It's like, well, they chose that area for a reason, but not everyone's, you know, as passionate as they could be in that space. So the caveat to that opening slide is this notion of the uneducated class. I normally start by accusing my audience of being fairly uneducated. I'll do the same for you guys as well. I suspect you guys are fairly uneducated. I know I am a fairly uneducated person. We tend to assume that people are educated because they have something to hang on the wall, right? I did a degree, I've got a PhD, therefore I must be educated. But in the context of education, Ruskin, 101 years ago, thought to himself, I think we could reduce education down to 3 questions. Apologies for the gender-specific way that he thought 100 years ago. First, where he is. Does the student know where he is? Does the student know where he is going? Does the student know what he had best do under those circumstances? And so he argued that an individual could, if they could navigate his or her way through life, they were educated. But to the extent that they couldn't, they were uneducated. So using this logic, you could argue that we tend to graduate a lot of uneducated people, right? Just to the extent that if I said, how about you write something down, Kath's going to take a picture of it, and then we're going to collate all those little pictures, and we're going to sell them this afternoon on Amazon, and we'll all be co-authors of that document. Does anyone want to volunteer that process? Does anyone want to collate it and upload it to Amazon? Is anyone comfortable doing that? So if that was what we wanted to do, we're in a moment of being uneducated, but we're most probably, hopefully, capable of working through what we would need to do, and then we become educated again. So we can view education as something we've attained, and we have it, or we can view it as something we move in and out of, depending on where we are and where we want to go. So this is quite a positive thing, because students like this. Students like to know that they don't have to pass the muster, that they are educated, that we all move in and out of it, and education can be this useful tool rather than an end journey for them. The second caveat is this notion of unfinishedness. Hoffa said that in times of change, and I think we can agree we're all living in that, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. He also said that nature attains perfection, but man never does. The perfect ant, a perfect bee, man is perpetually unfinished. He is both an unfinished animal and an unfinished man. It is an incurable unfinishedness which sets man apart from other living things. For in an attempt to finish himself, man becomes a creator. Moreover, the incurable unfinishedness keeps him perpetually immature, perpetually capable of learning and growing. So again, are we trying to get students to a finish line where we say you've now graduated as this finished product, or could we be helping them to understand that the finish line, that's this date when they graduate, is just another step in their journey of being unfinished? And we've helped them to be perpetually capable of learning and growing as they go forward here. Could our graduate be someone who we celebrate as being unfinished, not finished, but we've given the skills and the abilities to be this constant learner as they're going through? So that when they change from I'm here but I want to go to here, and I know how to make the journey happen because I'm good at learning and growing, we've got someone who can be uneducated and unfinished. And of course, Dewey, who's not foreign to many of us, he argued that the theory of effort was simply the substitution of one interest for another. So to what degree are our students interested in their studies, right? Could we allow them to bring more of their life into our studies, to increase their level of interest in what they're doing? How could the studies we help them with the journey they're on? I'm here and I want to go there, and this really good class I'm going to this afternoon because it actually helps me to understand how that journey is going to happen. So those three things, being uneducated, uninterested, and unfinished, I think are very central to developing a really positive mindset about what our graduates are going to be capable of after they've graduated. Not at graduation, but what they're going to be able to do after. So that's hopefully provocative enough to get you thinking. I wanted to share with you my teaching philosophy. It's not the whole philosophy, it's just a truncated version, but I want to highlight a little bit. It taps into a conversation that Kath and I are having around a whole series of complex matters. But I wish for my students the self-determined attainment of entrepreneurial knowledge that leads to entrepreneurial wisdom, so the application of the knowledge. I want my students to discover themselves in the lives they live. I want my students to be excited about learning and fearless of failing in the same breath. I want my students to be able to create opportunities for satisfaction within and after their university studies for a process of self-negotiated action. So at the moment, Kath and I are having some conversations, and we're thinking about, well, should we focus on this as the purpose for what I'm doing, or should my purpose be this? Because this is the driver of that, right? I want my students to have this, but I don't think they can have it if they don't have that. So it's an interesting philosophical question because we're trying to make sense of, well, where should the focus be? What should the communication be with the student? Should I get them to look at the glory of what's possible of becoming this student? Or should I get them to understand the mechanics of the learning that this could generate by achieving this? So hopefully this will all gel together as we go through the process. So in my context, and I'll just tell you the backstory, after 2 years of teaching entrepreneurship education in Tasmania, we had the first full degree, first major in entrepreneurship education in Australia. And I saw some students in town, students I got on with very well socially, and they crossed the road. I was walking up and thinking, oh, there's such and such, I'm going to have a chat. And they crossed the road, and I thought, oh, that's a bit weird. And so I crossed the road, and now they're trying to avoid me. They were embarrassed that they weren't entrepreneurs. I did this course. You think about it, right? You study engineering, become an engineer, study accounting, become an accountant, study nursing, become a nurse, study entrepreneurship. You don't always become an entrepreneur, right? Because at age 20, it's like studying marriage. At university, it doesn't mean you're going to be married by the time you finish the course, right? And so this led me to thinking, well, what is it that I'm trying to create with this student? If it's not an entrepreneur, what is it? And it's this self-negotiate, it's this intermediate step, something that I think will hold them in good stead. And so I'll put the elements up just to show you. I found this notion of the reasonable adventurer. The reasonable adventurer was a concept created by Heath in the 60s based on his studies through the late 50s at Princeton University. He tried to identify what is it about a graduate that gives them this ability to be satisfied and to create opportunities throughout their life. And he followed these students for 20 years, a whole cohort of students, not a large cohort, but a whole cohort of students through. What was it that would enable people to actually become great learners that could be very useful and continuously rewarding through life. And he came down to these 6 criteria. And so these are the curriculum elements that I have in my class. You could have them in your classes. It doesn't matter if you're teaching humanities or engineering or medicine, it doesn't matter, right? This is about how you teach, not what you teach. So this doesn't change the curriculum content. It only changes how you think about organising that content. So we want the students to be both critical and curious. So at no point do we want the students to say, well, Colin said it, so therefore that must be true. We want them to always ask the question, under what context would that be true? We want that question to always be front of mind so that they are sceptical but potentially believing. We want them to develop friendship with the other students in the class. So as the process goes on, if we're using group work or what other mechanisms, we want them to have a chance to discover the individuality of the other students. That is, we want their worldview to be potentially changed by their interaction with other people. We want them to be able to use their own independence in making value judgments. So what do they believe? And do they understand why they believe, where their values are from? And can they factor that into the nature of the decision making that they make? I'm a very unorganised person, so I'm an expert. That's maybe one of the few things I'm an expert in, is creating a classroom where there's a lot of ambiguity. My students generally complain. I got my evaluations for teaching for this semester, which is just wrapping up in Australia. And of the questions, the one that says that the lecturer was well organised, that's the one that's always is down. So it's sort of a good litmus test. Did they just tick all the way down, or did they actually look at the questions? Because if they did, that one would be equal, but it shouldn't be. And I don't worry about it because I want the students to experience a lot of ambiguity. I want them to have to find their way through that process, all right? I'm deliberately designing it in there. A breadth of uncommon interest, it means that there's an uncommon interest in the commonplace. So if I am teaching them engineering, I want them to think about how those concepts would relate to the problems in their own house or in their own community. And last of all, sense of humour. So getting them to have a relaxed environment where we can just enjoy that space and that time and that learning. So for me, using these as a curriculum elements, frameworks, allowing me to teach the content that I do, enables me to develop a type of student. This adventuring, which I'll define for you in a minute, I sell to the students as, I want you to become good at adventuring. That is, understanding where you are and where you want to go. And I want you to understand that your ability to do so will be, we could express as an equation of the level of your conviction divided by your perception multiplied by the luck that you encounter. Because at the end of the day, we can't take luck out of the equation. None of us can guarantee the future. And so adventuring I define as multiple micro life moments of action where you attempt to solve problems or create value. And the conviction is getting the students to understand who they are. Why are they studying what they're studying? What do they want to do with their future? And it's about getting them to understand their inner world. Who are they and why do they operate? Perception is their outer world. So here, we're trying to help the students to actually understand what exists outside of their psyche and how might they balance this with that. So in entrepreneurship, this is critically important because we're always having hopeful expectations about what we might be able to do in the future. I could get people to buy this and do that. But we need to be able to balance those perceptions against the reality of what actually exists in the world. Heath argued that we can have our reasonable adventurer, a graduate capable of creating opportunities for satisfaction, but to get the student, we have to be very respectful of the other 3 types of students that we would typically encounter in a learning environment. So student X is the uncommitted student. They're not particularly interested. They'll do their work at the last minute. They most probably might not always turn up to class. You've met them. They're just particularly uncommitted, right? Student Y is overcommitted. So they'll vomit at the prospect of having to do group work because someone's going to drag their mark down. You know, they'll be asking you the day before you release information on an assignment what's required and what's best, because they've got a GPA of, you know, down to the 20th decimal point, and they need to know exactly how to improve that. All right, and they're very committed. They know exactly what the grade means for their progression through this process. And then there's student Z. I was a Z. Z is the leaper. Z is the student who has a lot of enthusiasm, but is quite often misdirected. So they haven't really thought it through, but you enjoy having them in the class, even though they quite often miss the mark in what they're doing. So for all of those three students, to get them to an A, there's a process of getting them to understand their inner world. Getting them to, this is how much knowledge they have of X and Y. And as they increase their knowledge of who they are and why they operate, we increase the probability of them adjusting their behaviours and becoming a reasonable adventurer. So I'm sharing this with you not because I'm suggesting to you that you should adopt the reasonable adventurer, but what I think is you should have in your mind what your ideal graduate is, and you should work out how you would create that, okay? I found the reasonable adventurer and I've adapted aspects of it, and it suits me, but I'm not trying to sell you on the reasonable adventurer, even though I think it's a great approach. But what I think is everyone should say, well, what does a graduate for me look like, given how I teach, what my aims are, what my students are doing, you know, what do I think that, and how do I communicate to my students? That it's not just the content of a book, it's actually much more about what we're trying to do. So as I said before, the last part of my teaching philosophy was this notion of self-negotiated action. That's the minimal outcome that I'm trying to achieve with my students. And so I define that as the agency individuals demonstrate in directing their conscious thinking and acting towards an alignment of their inner and outer worlds in order to succeed in life. So I've got something about my understanding of who I am, and I've also got an understanding of the world that I need to interact with, and I can find a way of making these things align so that my conviction isn't unaligned to my perception of the world, and I want to be able to be successful in finding opportunities for my future growth and my learning. But to achieve this, to get to this point where we can get to the end, is not so hard, it's not so easy, and we can sort of reverse engineer it for what the world would need to look like. So this is just a form of entrepreneurial agency, and other people could call it anything. I've just called it that, right? But you could call it whatever. You could have engineering agency, right? You could just say, well, what the agency an engineer needs is all the things that you guys just talked about. They need to be able to explain complex situations. They need to be able to work with others. They need to be able to, all of those things. And so you could define what you think an engineering student needs to graduate as, so they have this agency. They front up to their interview and they can say, I'm ready to go. Day one, I can step into this space and I can contribute to your organisation. That suggests that we've been able to develop some very specific capabilities and competencies on the education process as we've been going through. It also suggests that we've been able to develop sufficient personal confidence that they can identify with who they are and the nature of the world that they want to interact with. And it also suggests that they've been able to have a degree of sense-making so that they're actually aware of this world that they want to develop this confidence of and take action on. So in terms of sense-making, and some of this relates right back to primary schools, right through to here, it's all the basics learned and no one left behind. As a student who was forced at the end of every year to go from grade 1 to grade 2 to grade 3, and the gap between myself and every other student just got wider and wider with every year of progression, I'm very mindful that it's very easy to get left behind because you got pushed ahead, right? And sadly, that's a bad aspect of our education system. So many of the students we get, they actually have stuff that they never developed, which we assume they've got, it's vital, but they don't have it, right? And I'm sure in engineering, I'm telling you nothing. I'm sure you've got many kids who can't do any maths, right? And you're thinking, why are you trying to do this engineering if you can't do the maths, right? So in terms of confidence, We want students who are able to develop enough confidence to have intentionality, forethought, reactiveness, and be able to be very reflective on the nature of that journey. How are they developing goals? How are they making action on those goals? And in terms of the capabilities and confidence, we want students who demonstrate an ability to learn any time, any place, at any pace. And we want assessment, in a perfect world, we want assessment to be against a performance situation. So we don't want to ask a student, well, could you measure? I don't want to keep picking on the engineering, but I feel like sometimes I understand. I used to watch engineering classes to help people with their teaching. If we want a student to demonstrate their understanding of vibration in terms of building a bridge, you know, we want them to demonstrate that knowledge, not just say, oh no, I'm pretty confident of that. Yeah, I'm pretty happy. I'm happy to say I know it. We need to be able to test these things against a performance situation. And you wouldn't go to a surgeon who had a lot of confidence. He said, oh, I'm very confident of my abilities to use the scalpel to take that appendix out. No, I'm very confident, very confident. We would want a surgeon who was competent. Competence, not 99%, not 55%, it's just competent. They've proved themselves against a cadaver, performance situation, whatever the process is. That means that we're trying to do these three things, sorry. That means that along the way, we've got to develop the right schemas. So there is basic learning things that need to be acquired so that they're committed to memory and we can draw upon them instantly. And I'm going to show you some of the challenges with that shortly. That means that not only were we mindful of the general needs, but we also wanted to factor in their immediate needs. So it's not like we've decided in advance that the curriculum looks like this and that's what you'll be doing. We've decided in advance the curriculum looks like this, and we've left some space open for you to bring your own interests in. Your own immediate needs can be addressed in this process. So this might not be the entire degree, but it might be just some of the modules that they're engaged in. And we're trying to get maximum interest for maximum effort, all right? We don't want this stuff to be boring to them, we want them to bring it into their own life so that they can actually live with these ideas and they can see how it's going to help them to get them from where they are to where they're going. So the big challenge that we have is these notion of schemas. If we don't develop them, then people are going to get left behind. And I always feel like I can speak about this authoritatively because I didn't get many of these schemas as a kid growing up. So I still experience the challenge. I'm pretty confident to bet, even for many of you who may not have had English as your first language, that it would take me longer to read a page of writing than it would you. It takes me a long time to read a page. I've got 450 assignments that are waiting on my laptops for me to assess. It's going to take me a long time. My student asked me the other day, he said, how strict are you on the word limit? And I said, I'm not particularly strict at all. So why is that? And I said, well, for me to go through and check whether you've gone over the word limit would take 1 or 2 minutes. There's 450 assignments, that's 900 minutes. Do the maths. I'm not going to worry about it. I don't have 15 hours up my sleeve just to check word limits. What I've been doing with my students, and this is thinking about being able to develop this graduate attribute, is we've been using low cognitive load theory to actually communicate to the students, why is it we're only going to give you a little bit of information rather than a lot of information every week? And so in your context, this might be, well, there is 1 or 2 units in the degree where you operate here, even though you know you've got content to get through, right? You might have external professional bodies who say, no, the accounting students must have this information all covered and they must demonstrate their knowledge of that. But when you can do this, it creates a different dynamic altogether. Because now you can say, well, there's a principle, there's some frameworks, and I want you to use them inside, out, backwards, in every possible way. But we want you to have such an understanding that it gets committed to memory and you'll be able to draw on that forever and a day. So this is a process of priming. We're trying to prime their mind, not just saying, oh, just go and do it. I mean, imagine, I know this building's new, but let's say I went back to the old building where Kath just moved out of and they wanted to tidy things up. So they gave me a bucket of paint and a brush. They said, if you could just make that a bit tidier, that'd be good. So I went in there and I just slapped some paint on, and then a year later we might get a phone call saying, you said you were going to tidy the walls. the paint's peeling off the walls, right? Because no one prepared the surface, right? No one made sure that the surface would be able to take that eventual paint. So to what extent are we preparing the minds of our students before we give them the big ideas, the things that we really want them to be able to have knowledge of, right? It's a really important concept, because without doing it, there's a possibility that the ideas might just basically bounce straight off. Got them, did my assignment, did my exam, but now 2 years later, oh yeah, I'll have to go and check that. I'll have to go and try and look at it. The context we live in is that we've got this working memory, and I'm going to give you a test on it in a minute. We've got this working memory, and we're using it all the time. So if I show you something that you're unfamiliar with, it's your working memory that's trying to compute that, that's trying to make sense of it, right? But if I show you something, like I ask you to do some basic algebra, you don't have to think about it because you already have the schema for it. You learned it ages ago, and you just draw on that instantly, and it takes over. And this doesn't have to do the work because now you've already got a reservoir of schemes, sense-making that you can draw upon. The problem is, when we're just in this space and the students don't have a chance to encode that down into here, because we've moved on, we've given them too much information, then we're stressing our students by keeping them in this space. We're not giving them a chance to develop that competency, those competencies, and those capabilities. So in my world, it looks like this. I help them to develop an understanding of their inner world by using the mechanism of why constantly, so the reflection process they use. They are constantly being forced to explore everything they say. So they say, I'm not feeling particularly well today, full stop, why? Because I've been sick lately. Why? Because I haven't been eating a lot of food well. Why? Because my friends told me that a vegan diet's a really cool thing. Why? And so on. So we get down to this underlying reason of why they're not actually eating well, or they're not feeling well, right? So it's not an easy process. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. If you've read the literature on transformational learning, you'll know it's not an easy walk, but it's a very rewarding walk. And the second one is I just have a very simple framework. It's not complicated. I've done all the work for the students. I've organised all the theory for them. But what I want them to do is not be experts on why the theory's in there, but understanding how the theory works and is interrelated with each other. So it's a sense-making framework for how they can understand any context that's in their outer world. Okay, so if you've seen this image with me before, that's cool. Keep your mouth a little bit quiet for a second. We'll go around the room. I'll give you a couple of seconds just to work out what it actually is you see here. You've seen it, Carolyn, haven't you? Mm-hmm. So we'll come back to you in a second. Okay, let's start from the top. Who could see 10? Who could see 8? Who could see 6? Who could see 4? Who could see 2? Who could see 3? So if you look around the room, 60–70% of you could see 3. And only one person could see 6. Of course, there's 6, right? So remember I did say that you guys look pretty uneducated, right? So why is it that we don't see these ones? Why don't we see those? Because we pronounce them like a V, right? So I asked you to read it, not circle them on a piece of paper. And so your brain hears the V and moves on, right? But if I showed you this again, did you see this one last time or not? May have done. Yeah, I think you're sounding like you're recalling something there. What about this? What shape do you see? Triangle? Where's the triangle? Triangle's got 3 sides, right? So there's no side here, is there? But there's no side here, is there? And what about here? We just got the dots, right? 3 dots. But our brain sees a triangle, right? So it doesn't always recall the right things. It can recall things, but doesn't mean they're going to be the right things. And our mind has a chance to correct things as we're going through. What about this number here? I'm going to give you a few seconds to see if you can memorise this number, all right? Have a crack at memorising this number. Of course, the challenge with trying to memorise that number is that there's a lot of numbers in it, right? And we can generally cope with 4 or 5 things pretty easily, But by the time we get up to this level, we're now getting that working memory and we're putting it in pretty high level of complexity, right? And so it's stressing itself out, right? Anyone want to have a crack? Can anyone remember it? It's tough, isn't it? There's too many letters, too many numbers, sorry. Of course, if you were from Holland, and specifically Maastricht, you might have no problems with that number at all, because you might have recognised that it's the phone number, right? If you ring the university often enough, you'd recognise that you only need to memorise these 4 numbers. If you had a schema that could simply recognise that that's actually a phone number, right? So the challenge for you guys is developing schemas. That's what my argument for you in terms of employability is what are the things that your students need to be able to call on, so across their degrees, bearing in mind that they may not have got some of it before they got to you. So what are the things that we will want them to be able to instantly call on so that they can continually progress through and make sense of the challenges that are in front of them, so that they've got this adventuring capacity in whatever the degree is. That's a big challenge for us all, to be thinking that through, rather than thinking what content should be in our degrees. In my world, I'm trying to do a couple of things. I'm trying to develop this notion of ceilings. So ceilings is just, it's a word I invented. If you can't spell, you should at least, become famous for inventing a word or two. Ceilings is just feelings you can see. They're produced by a conversion of an awareness of feelings into an understanding of feelings, into a greater sense of identity, and ultimately self-love. I want all of my students to love themselves, right? Think about your own lives when times have been crappy. Who can you rely on more than yourself to always be there for yourself? And your students are going to go through all of those tough times in their careers, in their personal lives. So helping them to develop a capacity for self-love and understanding who they are in terms of their identity is critically important. How many of you got students who are suffering on anxiety? Pretty common, yeah? It's a tough thing, right? And it's not like a harden up, go and see a doctor and get a pill for that. This is because they don't have this true sense of who their identity is, and they don't have enough self-love. It's a tough thing, right? And increasingly our students are in that space. So we're swimming against the tide. We're trying to help them to become graduates in a world where they don't feel like they belong. So it's almost like the cards are stacked against us all the time. And yet we can actually be a part of that solution by helping them. There's a reason why they chose your discipline area. Hopefully they see a career in that space. So if they want a career in that space, how do we help them to see that the learning that we're doing in this space can actually help them as an individual to actually go on that adventure into that space? Another one that I use in terms of sense making is situation awareness. I think this is something you can use in every one of our fields. It's a very, very simple theory. It says, does the person understand, have a perception of all the elements that are important in that particular environment? Do they understand how those elements interrelate or relate with each other? And can they then use that understanding to project into their decision making? So situation awareness was developed for the, not aerospace, but the aeronautical industry. Think about when you get on a plane. The pilot or pilots need to have absolutely up-to-date information about every aspect of the environment they're going to encounter. And they can't be ringing up and asking people about it. It needs to be presented exactly on that dashboard in a form that is usable. If they didn't have it, as conditions change, they wouldn't understand what that means. When the wind pressures picks up, how does that relate to other factors of the environment? Situation awareness just helps us to help our students to identify what are the aspects of the environment that matter in this particular task, whether it relates to their learning or it relates to their progression as they are trying to create it beyond their learning. How do they understand the extent to which these elements actually interrelate? So when I change this, what does it mean for that? So in my sense-making framework I showed you before there, those things are all interrelated, and I give them opportunities to go off and test the extent to which that happens. So I want you guys to imagine some schemes, and we'll go back around the room in a second. What are the core declarative and procedural knowledge bases So what do they need to know and what do they need to be able to do that would help, that underpin the future employability of your students? So what is the key knowledge you think those students need to have that would be pulled automatically from their long-term memory? And what are the key things they need to know how to do, right? The processes that they need to be able to engage with. So it's not just, I understand what algebra is, but I actually understand how to engage in it. I can do it. If you give it to me, I can work my way through it. I'll give you an example. If you gave me something to read and I struggle and I hit a few big words, my mind won't automatically sound through the syllables of that word. I would recognise it at some point eventually, but it might not be until after I've really almost given up on that, on being able to understand that word. So many of you most probably learnt that schema when you're at school, because the teacher was saying, now sound this out and sound it out, and eventually it's just something you do automatically. You don't think it. You don't say, oh, there's coming up to a big word. I better get ready to sound the syllables. Your mind just does it automatically for you, right? But when you don't have some of the schemes, it means that you're deficient in that process. You've stopped, right? So we'll go around the room in a second. I want you guys to think that through. What do you think your students need to know and be able to do in order to employ their ability as graduates? Maybe just have a chat on your tables, whether you want to talk about it as a collective thing or you want to talk about it as a discipline thing. Then we'll just go around and have a quick chat in a minute. Yeah, and I agree. And I think things like vulnerability is really important, because being prepared to be vulnerable, if I'm looking to employ you, tells me that you're okay to say you don't know, which means you might not make the mistake. And I sort of can trust you to go off and do your research if you have to, right? So you might be enthusiastic, but you're prepared to be vulnerable in the context as well. So there's a whole range of attributes that we can flesh into that space as well. I wrote this down this morning, and I thought I'd pop it in here because I think it's an interesting one to reflect on, that it's not easy to give students something useful. It's a tough job that we're involved with, but it's even harder to take them somewhere special. So this is a lot of times what we think you need to know, and this is sort of almost like the journey we would love to take you on. You know, this is not easy to get students to actually want to sign up for that journey, even if we vouch for it and get employers to come in and say, we were looking for people who've got these attributes, these skills, these knowledge bases. It's not always easy to do that. In terms of what the role of enterprise education can do in this space, as I said, it's not really about what you have to do, it's how you do it. Enterprise education doesn't seek to push content out of anyone's curriculum. It looks to say, well, given that you've got that content and those focus areas, how might you actually engage your students with those areas, right? That's all that enterprise education really does for the large part. Kath and Andy and I have been working on this enterprise triangle, and that really says, well, here's an inner world. We could have every student at a university working in this space. We could have large numbers of students trying to understand how this inner world relates to the outer world, and then we've got a process of just a few who might actually only want to have a business context as they go through here. We don't need to burden these students with the business context. We can free these students to actually understand who they are, how they relate to their outside world, how they can move forward, the type of graduate we want. And some of them will ultimately end up saying, I want to go off and do something pretty fancy. And we'll pin them up on the wall and say, look, they're one of our graduates. But I think the biggest challenge for entrepreneurship education in the next few years is volunteering to have itself measured at the level of the cohort. I'm not sure all of my colleagues would want to sign up for that, but I actually think if we're any good and we have an impact in what we do, let's measure it at the level of the cohort. Not their self-assessment, but their actual abilities. As opposed to just saying, well, we had someone got $1 million in funding, he's one of our past graduates, we must be doing something right in our class, even though everyone else might not have actually gone off and done anything else. So that's the challenge that I'm going to start pushing, is it's got to be useful for everyone. Otherwise, why are we doing it? It'd be like saying, oh, we've got a brilliant program here because it produces 2 PhD students every year. Well, we're not running the program an undergraduate to produce PhD students. We're running it for the betterment of the people who are involved, right? in terms of coming back to some of the points that have been made, this process of academagogy is a process of scholarly leading. So when is the pedagogy of the educator, their skills, their knowledge and their practice, when is that going to be applied to the students' curiosity, their passions and their aspirations? And to the extent that we can create a curriculum where these two things come through and lead self-directed students who say, I know where I am, I know where I want to go, and I'm going to get help to make that journey happen. We're there with them, and we're trying to find a balance between do we lead them, do we support them, and vice versa. This is something that I've just put together recently. I'm not going to go into it in any great detail, but academagogy, scholarly leading, this balance between pedagogical learning, student self-determined, and the pedagogy of the educator, there are a whole bunch of different knowledge bases that I think are really important for enterprise education to become important. Knowledge of yourself and your orientation to entrepreneurship education, knowledge of related theories, so that's the business end of things, knowledge of assessing outcomes, different outcomes in our world, whether they're competencies, actual business creation, personal development, knowledge of how to scholarly lead, so how to be that instructional person, knowledge of transformational learning, because it's not a knowledge base we're trying to give them, it's actually a greater understanding of who they are, and knowledge of student engagement. How do we get students to engage in this space? I think there's a whole range of knowledge bases that we need to become really proficient in to be able to say, I'm really good at being an enterprise educator. And I suspect many of you already have quite a lot of knowledge in these areas here, right? It's not like everyone has to start from scratch. This is a signature pedagogy that I'm just in the process of having published now. And the key thing, I'm arguing is there's like a base level of enterprise education that could apply for everyone, primary school through to adult education, everything in between. And it's built on 4 assumptions that our students tend to have 4 things in common in all of those areas. Naive assumptions that we have to help them to be mindful of, an unknown future, a delayed progression towards being an entrepreneur in any bona fide sense, and they have varying needs. And so we need a framework which actually allows these 4 things to be catered with through transformational learning to produce whatever we call our outcome student. For me, self-negotiated action, but for you, could be something else in that space. Something that relates to their agency. And this is my last slide. Jan Barnes from this part of the world, who introduced me at the Nexus conference to activity theory, and since then we've been doing a lot of work with activity theory because I think it is a fantastic framework for being able to take any context of education and being able to have a common language. So we can sit down and we can all talk about the roles, and we can talk about the rules and the nature of the context and the outcomes and the subject matter and the curriculum tools. We can use these common language to talk about all the different contextual challenges we face and have. Thinking about our scholarship of teaching and learning as it relates to this, because I think it's critically important that as we bring enterprise education into this space to help us to develop employability capabilities for our students, is that we ourselves are subjecting our thinking to that scholarly process. This is Glasnick's 1997 focus areas, and that is we need to make sure that we can communicate what our purpose is. We need to make sure that people actually understand the domain in which this purpose is being applied, and what knowledge we need. We need to be able to explain the nature of our practice, and I think this is where we go wrong. We explain our practice in such a way that no one understands what we're doing. But if we explain our practice using that, we're using the same language to explain our different practice. And I think this would be a really big step forward for us. We can explain our outcomes, and in our case, there's a whole range of from personal development through to venture creation. We can get validation by getting this work published and sharing it in forums such as this, and we can reflect on our own efforts to do this as scholars. And I think these are the big challenges in this space. It's not oh, we're going to introduce this process and that should fix employability. I actually think we're, as educators, a really big part of this jigsaw puzzle is that we need to become more scholarly so that we can better explain to our students what the purpose of this education is, and so they can actually go on the journey with us. I reckon I'm pretty good at explaining this to about 30, 40% of my students, and I reckon I've got 30 or 40% of my students who think I'm an absolute idiot, you know, who think that I'm cheating them, because I'm trying to help them to go in a journey which I see as being beneficial to them, but they just give me the theory so I can write the assignment and I can get the mark, the things I can control. And I'm trying to pull them into a space which is not particularly that easily to control, right? And it can be very uncomfortable. So none of this is easy, I don't think. I don't think there's anything easy here. There's no prescription, no magic bullet. But this process of becoming an honest witness to what we're doing, for me, I think that's the most joyful thing about being an educator, because then we can share it with other people and we can get their feedback. And I mean, when I came to the Nexus, you know, I wasn't looking for this, but when I found this, I said to Andy on the way home, maybe Kath, but I said to at least Andy, that's pretty cool, right? And the more I went away and thought about it and we worked with it, the more it just seems like what a super cool framework that we can all use, right? So I think you've already got some of the tools right here in your university to start the process. And I'm always interested in chatting to people about this process. So if you want to connect on Twitter or just send me an email and have a conversation, always happy to have that. I'll leave these slides here for, here he is, speak of the devil. I'll leave these slides here for Caroline to share with you if there's anything on there that you're interested in having a look at. But any questions or comments that you might like to share?
Then it's left to me then just to thank you, Colin.
Yeah, no problems.
Once again, a very inspirational talk and very engaging, very controversial in places, and I think we all welcome that. And it's from Kelvin's comment about trying to understand some of these things, because sometimes they are coming from unfamiliar territory, and I think that's really good to engage with that. So thank you once again for coming to talk to us today, and I hope it's not the last. So
yeah, lovely.
See you again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much, colleagues, for coming.
Yeah.